Hello, everybody. This is Kirk Kilgrave for the Kilgrave Corner, where horror writers talk horror. Today, my guest is Iain Wright, who has written over 30 novels and short story collections in his time. Iain, thanks for stopping by.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Kirk.
All right. So one of the things I noticed when I was speaking with Jeff Strand a while ago was that you and him had worked on a collection of 4 stories called Slice and Dice. It's like a
hmm
slasher book where 4 of you guys of authors got together and wrote this. I didn't really ask him too much about it, so I'm hoping maybe you can give me some insight as to how that came about.
Um, I generally refuse to work on anthologies and collections and sort of things with other authors, mainly because it's not conducive to the way I personally work. I don't like being beholden or working to deadlines, and I am quite sort of OCD about how things are done. So I mean, early on in my career, I kind of realised that I don't really enjoy working with other authors just because of the way I am. I tried to co-write a novel with Matt Shaw once, and it didn't work out, and that was kind of the last time I tried that. But Jeff Strand happens to be sort of one of my favourite authors, and before I ever wrote my first novel, I was reading his books, and um, right before I took the plunge myself, he was one of my main authors that I was reading. So he's an inspiration to me, and a lot of my work is sort of inspired by sort of his comedic timing that he puts into his horror and things. So um for me it was just the being able to work with someone that I respect so much was, I made an exception. So it was great to work with Jeff. I'd already knew him anyway briefly, as a social media friend, and he's a really nice guy. And it worked for me in that we just all went away, wrote our own separate novellas, and then stuck them together at the end. So again, that worked for me. And it was nice to sort of write to a theme as well, because after being a writer for sort of 10, 11 years now, you do run out of ideas. So having a theme to work to kind of forced me to to put my thinking cap on, and I wrote a story that was actually set in the future. So although it did feature a slasher, it was very sort of technology centric and a bit on the sort of the edge of becoming a dystopia. So I had a lot of fun with it, and it was nice working with the guys. And again, it's sort of, for me, it was a bucket list thing in that I got to work with Jeff Strand like I did at the beginning of my career. I got to write a book with J.A. Conrath as well. So there are certain times when you do something just for the pleasure of sort of being able to say that you did it.
Yeah, exactly. I know I was kind of surprised Jeff actually was on the show because first off, I love his work, and he was just like, "Yeah, I'd love to be on." So that was great, and to hear his insight, especially how he goes about, determining what novels he's going to write and how he comes up with his ideas, it just made me feel like I have a long way to go in the writing world. But
Yeah.
that was really interesting. What is your story about in this collection? You said it was dystopian. It's a slasher one. What can you tell
It's
us?
about, and what a big problem I have is as soon as I've written a book, it goes out my head, and sometimes people come up to me and ask about a book, and they mention a character, and I'm like, who? If I remember correctly, it was about somebody that works for the government reclaiming sort of what you would call brown sites in this country. It's basically, dilapidated buildings and unused land, and reclaiming these sort of eyesores and turning them into public spaces. And throughout the story, you kind of find out that there's a bit of a grubby, corrupt background to that. And this one person, our main character's kind of made a few decisions that aren't necessarily ethical. The stalker in our story is someone called the Reckoning, and he's basically going around sort of making social justice decisions and punishing
Hmm.
those who have this veneer of respectability, but beneath that, they're abusing other people. And sort of she becomes victim to the building that she lives in that she actually helped design, in that the Reckoning is basically a hacker slash serial killer, and he hacks the building and uses it against her, and it makes it impossible for her to escape. And you can turn the oxygen off in the buildings because if you can hear kids screaming, I apologise.
It's you,
But
you know you you write horror, so I totally get that
yeah,
there might be some murder of children in the background right now.
Well, essentially, it's a bit like I forget who wrote the book now, but was it Dean Koontz that wrote a long time ago, The Demon Seed? It was a house
Yes.
that turned against the owner. So it's a bit like that, and a bit sort of a new wave serial killer that uses technology. That's it in a nutshell, really.
Got it. All right. So I'm kind of getting the idea that you like slasher fiction and movies. Is that right?
I do. I mean, my favourite type of movies is sort of apocalypse and zombies, and I also love sort of, I suppose you could say, game show horror. I love things like Squid Games that have just come out, and
Yeah.
what is that one where they're all stood in a circle and the triangles keep going on and off at their feet? I really like that one as
I
well.
think that might be called The Circle. I'm not sure. I
Yeah,
know I just started watching Squid Game last weekend and I have about 3 episodes left. For those of you listening, watching, the first, for me at least, the first couple episodes were kind of slow and then it got me into it. And then I was just like, I have to keep going because it gets really good. So keep that in mind.
yeah. I really love things like that. I love situations that sort of force people to they either become heroes or villains, but you don't always know until they're put in that sort of pressure cooker. And I suppose that's the same reason I like Apocalypse, because you have these ordinary set of characters and then you watch who they become. And I really enjoy sort of those quick,
Hmm.
snappy sort of character arcs that tend to happen in those genres.
So Walking Dead, you're a fan of probably.
Less and less as the years go
Oh,
by,
yeah,
but
yeah. I hear you.
yeah, I think I've had about enough of Morgan Jones as I can stand in Fear the Walking Dead. But
Yeah,
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 I do love things like that.
it's getting a little long in the tooth, as they say. I still watch it just because how much I've enjoyed it, through seasons 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Yeah,
And I think that's really about it, or maybe 8. But yeah, ever since Rick left, there's been like a hole in the
yeah,
universe of their show because
no.
he was the one who tied it all together.
Well, I think they could have got away with getting rid of Rick, but they needed Carl to kind of continue that lineage, and by getting rid of both
Yes.
of them, they kind of just took the heart out of the story. Sometimes TV show makers make the strangest decisions.
Yeah. When I was watching that, I hated Carl up until the last year that he was in it.
Yeah,
And then he was actually a really good character. I was like, I was finally interested to see how he was going to really develop into a man, and they killed him. And I was pretty
yeah.
disappointed in that. But, that's what we do. We kill people in our stories and so forth. So one of the questions I wanted to put to you with the thriller or the stalking type slasher thing was, if you had Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers in a battle royal in a wrestling ring, who would come out the winner?
I suppose Jason, because he's supernatural, whereas I mean Michael's kind of dabbled with the edges of being supernatural and the what is it, the curse of the thorn and things on his wrist. But
Huh.
I mean, essentially, Jason's an actual supernatural monster, isn't he? So I think he would probably win because you just wouldn't be able to kill him permanently.
I didn't know he was supernatural in nature. I always thought he was just some guy going around killing people. I think, seen like maybe one or two of the films. So I might have to
Well,
delve
I
into
think,
that.
I mean, obviously, the first film, it's his mother, but didn't
Yeah.
he drown at the camp and then he kind of comes back as, I suppose, a zombie? You would
Huh.
classify him as. But again, it's been a while since I've watched those films, so I might be
Yeah.
misremembering.
Yeah, me too. So you mentioned that you like apocalyptic, and I know you've written in that, and I know the Final Winter, it was your first book, and that's pretty much an apocalyptic thriller, right?
Yeah, it
Yeah,
is.
and I
Yeah,
think I think that's I think from what you've said, that's your favorite that you've written, right? So far?
it's well, I mean, it's my favorite because it changed my life literally. I'd quit my job as a salesman unceremoniously because I'd had enough. So I was effectively jobless, but I'd been working on this novel for a few months. And my sort of my wife now, but my girlfriend then, she gave me 6 months to get my act together. Basically, you can try and make this book thing work, which sounded like pie in the sky to her, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And I was probably deluding myself, to be honest. She gave me 6 months, get a job after that, but you want 6 months to try and make your dream happen, then do it. I'll support you. Um, and within 6 months, I'd replace my income from a sales job with that one book, Final Winter. A lot of that had to do with timing. It was 2011. There was only 500,000 ebooks around. So if I tried to do that now, I don't think it would have worked. It's much more. I wouldn't say, I don't want to say more difficult because I don't want to discourage people. It's still very much achievable to become a full-time author, self-publishing or traditional. But I certainly had it easier because luck and timing played a big part in me getting that foothold early on. That I then worked very hard to keep.
Yeah.
But I certainly had a bit of a shortcut that I don't think I would get now.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's my favorite book just because it literally changed my life. It was like winning the lottery.
Wow. Congratulations on that. And you mentioned luck played a part in it, but also writing a good book also happened to, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Although I'll say that the book that's available to buy today is different to the one that I put up on KDP back then. It had a self-made cover. It hadn't been edited by anyone but myself. There's definitely some tricks I picked up that when I went back and re-edited it a few years later, I did improve the book. So I did get away with a little bit of shoddiness again because there wasn't as much competition. But I think, yeah, ultimately the story was good. People enjoyed the story. It was probably a little bit different, a little bit rougher than what a traditional publisher would have accepted. So for that reason, it was unique. So yeah, I think the easy part is telling a good story. I think for me, the struggle is always trying to, do the craft and the technique, and
Hmm.
that's the part of me that always evolves. Whereas telling the story, that was kind of what I had first. I always had these stories I wanted to tell, and that just comes from being an avid reader and watching lots of movies. My head's always full of stories. That the skill of being a writer and what you train to do and practice is telling them effectively and well, and trying to tell them in a way that the reader kind of loses sight of the fact that they're actually reading a book. They're just in the story, and that's the professional part of the job. I feel that's what you practice at and you learn and you get better at.
Yeah. So, I mean, like you said, that was 10 years ago. I don't know of many authors at that time that were actually doing apocalyptic fiction. Now, if you're on Amazon, you see them all over the place. I was a huge fan of that when I started reading it, I think in the late 90s, maybe mid 90s, when I read The Stand and Swan Song by Robert McCammon. Have you read those two?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah.
Yeah,
At
Robert
that time,
McCann's a big favourite of mine.
which one is?
Robert McCammon.
Yeah. Yeah. I know you mentioned that you're a fan of Stephen King, and all the interviews I've done, the last one I did was the only one where I didn't, where someone didn't mention Stephen King. You said once that you'd love to have a chance to meet with him, and my question to that was, if you did, if he's like, "All right, Ian, let's chat," and you're sitting there drinking coffee or a beer, what would you talk about? What would you like to ask him or tell him or what have you?
Oh, I mean, I try not to, if I do meet people I respect, to just try and take but what would you do with Stephen King? You'd want to know the secrets. So I'd suppose I'd sort of I'd just ask for his insight, especially when it pertains to sort of characters, and how does he manage to keep his patience in telling a story, because he tells them very gradually, very slowly. It takes a lot of pages to do it. Whereas for me, I always have sort of an eagerness to get it told, and sort of slow boiling things and holding back, answers and things. It's quite difficult not to get carried away and spill things very quickly. And I think he's a master at sort of having enough faith in himself that he doesn't need to give everything away really quickly. You can read 100 pages of Stephen King where very little's actually happened plot wise, and yet you're still engaged. And I think that's possibly part of what his crossover appeal is with sort of people who aren't traditionally horror fans. He can draw you in with the mundane before he then, does something a little bit less believable that some people would turn away from. Yet by that point, they're engaged in the characters, and I think that's a real skill of his that not everyone has.
Yeah. Now, I mentioned that you mentioned that you wrote apocalyptic. We mentioned that you've done a slasher novella. It seems like, based on some of the other books you've written, which we'll talk about, but it seems like you can really like hop around in subgenres of horror. How do you go about finding out what you're going to write next?
Well, I didn't want to get pigeonholed as an apocalyptic writer or a zombie guy. Um, because horror's quite a small genre in sort of contrast to things like thriller and erotica and crime. So the more you pigeonhole yourself within horror, the smaller your audience gets. So business wise, it's definitely beneficial to kind of try and encompass the whole of the horror genre or even other genres if that's what you want to do. So from a business standpoint, I never wanted to get pigeonholed, but I do enjoy sort of all kinds of horror and I do want to tell all kinds of stories. So for me, it's, I do need a break from sort of apocalypse. So, I'll go off that for a couple of books because I don't want to keep writing in that genre. But then that's my favorite genre. So it always tends to pull me back. But a lot of the time I get inspired by sort of films that I'm watching and books that I'm reading. And sort of The Final Winter was inspired by the movie Legion, in which the angels were the bad guys and the sort of the devil was the good guy in that. And that's all it was that inspired me to write The Final Winter. I liked that sort of taking expectations and flipping them around. And I enjoy doing that with, as much as possible with all my books. If I'm going to write about a vampire, then I'm not just going to write about a vampire that everyone expects, because what's the point of writing that? So I do try to flip expectations as much as possible. And I do love character arcs where the bad guy comes good and the good guy turns bad. I really enjoy that. So I have a lot of sort of anti-heroes and reformed villains in my stories.
Hmm. Now, I get Goodreads newsletters, and I'm not sure if you do, but occasionally they'll often send us emails and so forth about upcoming books and different genres and so forth. And I've noticed over the last few months or so, I never really paid much attention to it before, but they'll have something in there for contemporary romance. They'll have something in there for um, science fiction. They'll have other stuff in there for fantasy, but I never see anything in there for horror. Why do you think that is?
I suppose it probably stems from the 80s with the video nasties and things like that. I think there's what's the word? There's a sort of a veneer of illegitimacy about horror that if you want to be a respected magazine or website or whatever, then horror might possibly taint you with things less savory. So I suppose I think there's a misunderstanding of horror as well. I think it's very much about catharsis and good overcoming evil and fighting our fears. And I think it's actually a really uplifting genre of novels. But for those who don't enjoy the genre, they have these sort of preconceptions about what horror is, and you get things which don't do the genre any favors, like the Serbian film, which is just vile, and they get lumped in, unfortunately. Whereas you don't get, say, bad romance sort of films or novels that are sullying that genre. Whereas horror, there's always this sort of subset attached to it that is pretty reprehensible and not really artistic, and it has to carry that weight, I suppose. And I suppose some websites, they just don't want to take the risk of being associated with that. But I don't know really. I mean, readership wise, it is a smaller genre, compared to crime and erotica and romance. It's tiny. But I feel like science fiction can equally be as niche, and that gets a lot more respect, and
Mm-hmm.
it's seen sort of as a lot more artistic, I suppose. And I suppose that's just the way it is. But horror isn't for everyone, so perhaps it never will be fully mainstream for that reason.
Yeah, it's really kind of strange because, like you said, science fiction, it does seem to get a lot more credit. There's, bigger awards, the Nebula and the Hugo Awards. I
Yeah.
mean, I know those, but horror, there's the Bram Stoker Award or the Stoker Awards, and there's a few more, but they're just not nearly on that level. And it just kind of stumps me because when you think of science fiction, I think people give it more respect because you have to maybe use your imagination a little bit more because you're either going out into other
Yeah.
planets or you're looking into the future, whereas horror is just, it's here and there. I mean, you can do some time travel if you wanted to in the genre, but it's really the horrors that we face on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's one of the reasons, another one of the reasons that Stephen King is so popular. If you look at a book like It, which was fantastic, it's about a bunch of kids and their experiences. And there really wasn't much going on in the first 425
Hmm.
pages at least when it comes to like a horror aspect. But at that point in the book, I was so hooked on these characters and I knew them so darn well that I didn't really care. And only when, the clown came out and started scaring them did it get even, more terrifying.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'm stumped with why people, you know, readers, whomever, think it's totally cool to see this movie over the weekend where, Michael's just slashing people up. And I did see it. It had some really unique kills in there. I got to give it credit for that. But, I mean, it's basically just some guy going over killing people. And, the
Yeah.
first one I thought was way better than the second one. Same could be said of the original too. But, there's also films like Get Out, which has a lot more social commentary.
Yeah.
And, I mean, a lot of authors now I think, are really trying to push the idea of horror into a different level of respect by really looking at what's going on in the world and making it more tangible and
Yeah.
noticeable. Whereas before it might be a metaphor and it wasn't really as obvious. Whereas now they're not really hitting on the head with it, but it's like you have to draw the parallels with these.
Yeah. I think you've got takers disrupting the market like Netflix, and that's allowed sort of horror to come into its own a bit. Certainly in movies, not possibly necessarily so much in sort of literature. Um, but I suppose there's a certain amount of safety when you're watching it in a cinema or on Netflix because it's almost been vetted for you, so it's not going to be something completely left field that's going to disturb you or take you by surprise. So there's a certain safety in sort of the movie world of horror that is sort of with the wild west of publishing at the moment. You can sort of end up reading something that you really didn't want to be. But I certainly think, I think horror has matured a little bit, and it's certainly got a lot more to say now. And yeah, I think Netflix and Amazon Prime Video and that taking the risks that they know they need to disrupt the market. That's really helped horror. It's probably benefited horror more than anything else, along with sort of foreign cinema. I think we're getting a real boon as well.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of your idea there about Netflix and so forth, because they put forth commercials and viewers can go over, look at those commercials for a minute and a half and really get the idea of what's going on in it. For books, all you have are words, reviews basically.
Yeah.
You can review it, but you really don't know what's in the book. So I hadn't given that. That's a very good perspective to take. I hadn't thought of that. So we mentioned that you've been in the field for about, well, 10 or 11 years or so. And I mentioned that you've written tons of books. I do have to say that if you go on to Iain's website, he does offer 6 books for free if you sign up for his newsletter. All you got to do is put in your email address and you're good to go. So give that a shot. But how do you think that horror has evolved over the past 10 years and horror readers have evolved over the past 10 years?
Um, I think it's become a lot more tailored. I think I know now that I've built up an audience, but also that I know how to reach the right type of people through Facebook advertising and Amazon advertising. That I can write a book about a three-legged lesbian werewolf, and that will find the correct audience. And audience sizes vary, and I know that some books I write are going to be more successful than other ones, and I have to balance what I'm writing with making a living. Um, but I think nowadays you can literally write whatever you want and that's okay. No one's going to tell you that it won't sell. No one's going to tell you that no one will read it. You can write a book for one other person and that's okay, and that person will buy it. So I think the breadth of ideas now is 10 times as big because nothing's off limits now. You can be whatever author you want to be, writing about whatever you want to write. And you can reach the correct audience for that, and that's great. It's led to, I mean, if I want to read a certain book about a certain thing, I know that I can use sort of online tools to find that exact book and read exactly what I'm looking for. And one things I love about literature is it's overwhelming, the amount of choice. You can watch every horror movie and be in a position where you're like, I've seen it all. I've seen every movie worth watching. I know every horror movie that's any good, and now I'm just waiting for the next ones to come out in the cinema, which might be a few good ones a year. With books, I feel like I would never ever manage to run out. That if I want to read exclusively zombie novels, I feel like I could be reading them to the end of time. And good
Yeah.
ones, obviously, you need to do a bit of research to find what's worth reading. But it's great that we're now in a time where you can just, for a low price, be served constantly with the exact content that you want to write, and then authors can write the exact content that they want to write. There's no, I mean, there is financial considerations, but there's no editors or publishing houses pigeonholing authors or forcing them to write things they don't want to write. I'm sure if J.K. Rowling was self-published, she might not have written as many Harry Potter books. She might have gone on to something else a bit quicker. But the pure force of the money behind her and all the people making money from that, she probably felt she had no choice but to keep writing Harry Potter books. And now she'll forever be the Harry Potter author. And she might have wanted that, but there's a good chance that she didn't want that, and she didn't want to. She's probably got something inside of her that's got hundreds of other stories to tell, but there'll always be that pressure on her to write Harry Potter books. And I think that's probably the same for a lot of traditional publishers, published authors. And sort of in the past, there's been a lot of times when an author might want to write 3 or 4 books a year, but their publishing house has said, no, we only want one every 18 months, and you're locked in. You can't go to another publisher. And in the past, they would set up pseudonyms to get around that, and that's why certain authors had pseudonyms. But to me, it boggles the mind that an author would only release a book once every year or 2 years, and that's crazy for me because that's such a slow pace, and it was enforced. It wasn't necessarily because the author took a year and a half. So it's like being a carpenter, but you can only work 2 months a year, and the rest of the year you got to sit around. So it's crazy. So I think it's a really good place at the moment where readers are being served with what they want, and authors have the freedom to do whatever they want. And even traditionally published authors now, like my friend Adam Neville's, he's got movies coming out all over the place on Netflix. He's got traditional books, but there's also some things where he's indie published them because it didn't fit with what he was being told he could do, so he did it himself. And I suppose you call that hybrid authors now, I suppose, but you've got the freedom to completely be in business for yourself, and that's great.
Yeah. Now you touched on something that Jeff Strand had mentioned, talking about sort of trying to find some type of median when you want to come up with an idea. And what he was saying was you have to try to make sure that you write something that will at least help out with bills and so forth. That not something that's he knows sometimes if he wants to write something he will, but he'll just have to understand that it might not do as financially well as some of the other ones that his readers seem to be clamoring for. Is that
Yeah,
something you struggle with, or do you take that into
definitely.
consideration?
I wrote 3 thriller novels that were in sort of the vein of 24, but with a female protagonist. I wrote 3 of them, and they just bombed. And the reason for that is I
Hmm.
built a horror audience, and they didn't want that. At the time, it was early on, and I thought that I could write any book about any genre, and it would sell because that it happened with horror. And like I said, I was very lucky with my first few books; they came out at the right time. By the time I wrote my thriller books, things had matured, and it was harder to sort of you know get a foothold. So they completely bombed. They didn't make me any money compared to my horror books. But I'd always planned 4 books, so I left it completely unfinished. This 3-book series needed its final chapter, and I left it probably 5 years. And periodically, I would get messages from those who did enjoy the books and did find the books, and I'd always say, "Yeah, I'm going to write another one. I'm going to write another one." But the pure fact of not being able to take the financial hit meant it took 4 or 5 years until I actually got around to writing it. And I wrote it knowing it wouldn't make much money, and it didn't. I wrote it, made, I got a bit of a bump from it, maybe an extra £1,000 the month it came out, which isn't a great deal for my new releases. But I knew that going in, and I had to plan for it. And I gave those readers that had stuck with me with those novels, I gave them what they deserved. I gave them an ending, and I did that purely for my respect of those readers that were supporting me in a smaller way with these thriller novels. But the book, it was almost like skipping a release because it just didn't give me the earnings that that I'm used to. So yeah, I knew that going in, and it played out exactly like that. And the only time my thriller books ever make any money is when I advertise them on Facebook to a thriller audience. They rarely make any money through sort of my newsletter, my
Hmm.
website. The audience that I've established, I have to actively promote those books and spend money advertising them to get a return. Um, so yeah, definitely, I would have written that book a lot sooner if I could have afforded it. But I mean, I'm growing up a bit now. But I grew up very poor, and when I started making money with books, I was spending it. And I became to rely on every penny. Now that I get a bit older, I'm being a bit more stable, giving myself a bit more breathing room, that I can afford to kind of go off on a tangent and write something just for myself, or for a smaller subsection of my authors, of my audience. But back then, it was kind of chasing my tail in that I was having to write what I knew people would buy, and that's not always fulfilling. So it was a trap I put myself into. Whereas my advice now to sort of a new author is if you are making good money, money that you never thought you would be making, be a bit smarter with it. Don't get trapped in this consumerist hell of bigger houses, nicer cars, needing to show how successful you are. Because then you reach getting near 40 like myself, and you realise you've just made life harder for yourself.
Yeah. Wow. But we were talking about movies and we were talking about Netflix and so forth. And because there's so much content coming out with TV shows, with movies, do you think that it's harder to scare people now than it was 10 or 20 years ago?
It's definitely hardest to surprise people. I mean, there's the old adage that there are no new stories, only new ways of telling them. So surprising an author, surprising a reader, and giving them something they genuinely haven't seen before is always a task. It's always difficult, um, and that's why I said I do like to try and flip sort of preconceptions and take someone by surprise. The main way I do that is by killing characters off that you really didn't think I would kill off, and that's kind of something I've been known for a bit. And um, my readers do really enjoy that, so they definitely enjoy surprises, and they definitely enjoy not knowing what's coming. But there was actually a, a science experiment done a few years back that actually had two test groups. One group was told how a book would go, that they were told the plot beforehand, all the spoilers, and the other were told nothing about it whatsoever. They actually found out that the group, the subsection that knew what was going to happen, enjoyed the book more than those who went into it completely blind.
Huh.
So you can completely kind of give someone the comfort of knowing where a story is going to go, you know, but then you need to make up for that lack of surprise, I suppose, with characters that are really well fleshed out. And stories are universal. There's certain plot points which are always satisfying. That's why the final girl. You take the character that looks the weakest, most defenseless, and they're the ones that make it all the way to the end. People always get a kick out of that, and it's uplifting and empowering. So you don't always have to completely spin things on their head for the sake of it, just to try and get a Shyamalan type twist. Sometimes that can actually hurt you more than it helps you. And you look at Shyamalan's career after Sixth Sense, and that people began expecting these twists, and it actually ruined the films. He took a bit of a down turn then, because people knew he was going to try and flip things, and then it ended up being unsatisfying. So I think as an author, some books, the surprise is almost that there is no surprise, and people are waiting for something to happen that's out of the ordinary. And when it doesn't, they actually almost get a kick out of the fact that it did go how they expected it. I suppose you just got to try and not be formulaic. You've got to try and put your own spin on everything. And I think sometimes some amateur authors who are still learning their craft, that they make things too twisty and turny, and it gets, I think it causes, I suppose, stress, I suppose, and anxiety, and it's not always enjoyable to be in that state of mind. Sometimes it's really nice to feel sort of comfortable with a book, and even if you do kind of know where it's going, you don't mind as long as you're being led by the hand and it's an enjoyable experience.
That's really insightful what you said about the two groups, because I was reading an interview last night between an author who normally writes crime thrillers, Michael Cordia. Hoping I'm pronouncing it right. He was having an interview with Alma Katsu, who wrote gosh, The Deep, and another book, I forget, it was about the Donner Party, a horror book about the Donner Party. And that one got
The
rave
Donna
reviews.
Pass or something, wasn't it?
Which one was it?
The Donna Pass or something. I don't know
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
remember the film.
yeah. Um, it was that one. And they were, Michael Courtier was telling that he'd written a book called The Chill, I think it's called, under the name Scott Carson, I believe it is. And he was talking about Stephen King. And what was interesting is that he was mirroring everything you just said about the two study groups. He said, in the book The Shining, you know automatically that it's going to be a big storm, snowstorm. You know that the boy is going to have to use his shine in order to get in touch with
Yeah.
the older gentleman. You know that, they're going to be stuck in the hotel. You know that all this, he just went on and on, listed like five or six things. He's like, but it doesn't matter because Stephen King didn't tell you when it was going to happen, and he didn't tell you how it was going to happen or why it was going to happen. And that was really interesting. I would have never even considered something like that. So you've
Yeah.
opened my eyes to something that I was just thinking, well, maybe, but now that you put it in that context, it really does kind of make sense because readers want to read our books for a certain reason.
Yeah.
Granted, they want to be surprised, maybe at a certain point or maybe a little twist here or there, but they do want what they want, and that's what they're expecting you'll give them. So very good perspective there. When you mentioned killing characters, now I love killing characters, and I got it from this girl right here, Buffy. And I know you're a fan of Buffy and Angel, and I think
Yeah.
Angel did an even better job of killing off characters and being surprising and having their characters, their personality twist and turn,
Yeah.
change and go back and forth. Those are my two favorite shows of all time, just because of that.
Yeah.
Followed one of which is 24. I love that show and Alias as well. They both came out around the same time, but killing characters. I had one novel that I've written. It was my favorite book that I've written. It was so much fun. I had an outline done, but I was also still riffing on, oh, I could do this, I could do that. And I think people kind of rebelled against me because the character I killed, they liked so much. But it was sort of like that had to happen for the other
Yeah.
characters to develop. And
Yeah.
that's, I think, one thing that a lot of readers don't get. It's like, oh, I want that character back. She reminds me of this person or this person I know. And that's number one, a great
Yeah.
compliment. But at the same time, it's fun killing characters because it's a surprise. And two, it does, as long as it makes sense and as long as it moves the story forward and as long as it makes your characters continue to evolve, if you don't do that and it's just a shock,
Yeah.
it's pretty I don't know, stupid, I guess, because there's no reason for it. There's no jeopardy or trauma that can be mined from it.
Mm.
So yeah, is that kind of your take, or do you have a different spin on
Yeah, I
that?
think if you're going to kill a character, then it needs to affect the story arc of at least one other character. So, there's no point killing a character that no one cares is dead. So, I mean, recently I killed the main character to a book series I've written, and then it kind of takes off with his brother, and his brother's completely changed because of that. So it the death keeps the story moving forwards. It just switches to a perspective of a different character, but that death's always kind of part of their character. It's kind of an accumulation. And I think it's important that if you do kill a character, their death should be almost poetic to the story that they've been in so far. If you've got a character that's been selfish throughout, then their death at the end should be them being selfless to show that they've had their little moment and they have changed. They shouldn't start selfish and then die being selfish, because that's you know it doesn't really add anything to this. There's no payoff to that. And I think what's good about killing a character off maybe midway through a story is it gives you that little shot of adrenaline, that early payoff that you're not expecting, and it's just gives a bit of impetus, I suppose, to the sort of the middle of the book that can drag. But yeah, definitely, I think of killing a character more on how it will affect the characters that are still alive, rather than thinking about why I want to kill that character. I'm thinking why that character and not these ones, and how is which death is going to affect the living characters the most. And I think that's the person you should kill.
Yeah.
The one that's going to be such an impact to everyone else.
Right, exactly. So just a couple more things I wanted to get across. First off, you've written a bitch. You've written a bitch called The Witch, is what I was trying to say. And I think that's done really well for you.
It has
The
really.
cover is really cool. It really, I mean, for me, it was like, what is this about? So what can you tell us about that one?
It's actually the first cover for my new artist, Kilgraves, and it's actually been my best-selling novel ever, by quite a long shot. It really took off. It advertises really well as well. So when the sales started to die off a bit, I just turned on some ads and it shot straight up again. So it must be something to do with the sort of the concept is really easy to get across, and it's really attractive to horror readers. As you know, there's a couple of things in there. It's a story within a story. There's an overall wrapper, which I think came to me from the Tales from the Crypt films, and that there's an overall sort of wrapper story. I can't remember what it is, but it's a boy on a bicycle, and he's reading the stories in the comic, and then you go into the little segments, and then it comes back out into the overall sort of the wrapper story. And I wanted to do that with my book. So the wrapper story is that these thousands of these manuscripts have been found all over Earth, and anyone that reads these manuscripts dies, and they're referred to, locked up in the Vatican, and referred to as the cursed manuscripts. There was the first wave of these books that are all in the Vatican, but now a new set have started turning up, and those books are the books that I'm writing. So Witch is actually one of these manuscripts that someone's found. So it's meant to be that you're reading one of these cursed manuscripts that'll kill you, and it's this story within a story. So it kind of hits on two fronts. I've got an attempt to get the reader's attention with the wrapper story, and then if I haven't quite got them, they read down, and then they've got the story of Witch as well. So it's kind of trying to grab them with two separate stories. And I found the wrapper story is what's bringing people in more than the actual plot of the book itself. And they're really liking this sort of, I suppose you would call it a mythos that's overall, it's got this, it's bigger than just the sum of its parts. And then the book I'm writing now is the next cursed manuscript. So they're all going to share this kind of cover, this sort of crumpled page with a red image on it, and they're all going to share that branding. And it's going to allow me to, because series sell really well, they make a lot of money for a lot of authors, but I don't always love writing series. I do really love jumping about and writing different things, but I obviously financially I love the benefit of a series that keeps people hooked and purchasing book after book. So it's kind of, for me, it was my way to kind of make my standalones into a series. So they are standalones, and I'll link them together a bit, because my readers really love these little Easter eggs where a character might pop up in another story and things like that. So I'm going to do that to serve my readers, but it creates a series of a bunch of standalones, and that's worked really well for me. And I think it kind of hit as both. People want to get involved in this overall world of the cursed manuscripts, and then they also just want to read the individual stories. So for me, it was a bit of a masterstroke. I think it's worked exactly as I hoped it would, and
Awesome.
people are waiting for the next book, and I'm really enjoying writing it because it's a standalone. It's completely new, completely fresh, but it's also
Yeah.
within this framework, and the brandings are all going to be shared. My artist knows exactly what he's got to do, because we'll be using that template, and people are going to keep seeing these covers, even if they're for different books. The shared branding is going to make people go, "What is this? I keep seeing
Yeah.
this."
Yeah.
So yeah,
It
it's something I did from a branding point, and it's worked really well.
Yeah, it reminds me, your premise reminds me a little bit of The Ring, but yours is a little bit more in depth. So, say for instance, the original Ring, or Ringu, I guess it was. I haven't
Yeah,
seen that movie, but you watch something and then 7 days later you're going to die. Yours is a little bit, I should say, a lot more in depth. Whereas they just watch the same video over and over. You're actually giving them a story within a
yeah,
story, whereas theirs was a videotape within a movie, but you actually give a lot more information, and that's really cool, and that might be one of the reasons why it took off the way it did. So
yeah.
congratulations on your
Thank
success
you.
with that one. Yeah, and I know you're going to be, you said, making it into a series related. Number one, I think that's awesome because I love adding characters, mixing and matching who goes into which one. It's fun to see regular characters that have popped up in other ones, but how many do you think you might continue with in this series?
Um, I don't know. It might just be an ongoing thing forever. Every time I write a standalone, I'll stick it within that series. But I also know that people want me to tell the actual cursed manuscript tales. At some point, they're going to want a book that's it's about the overall story. It's about what these manuscripts are. So I think that will probably be the end game when I actually go and write that book that actually explains, the meta, story of what the manuscripts are. So I'm not too sure. The one I'm writing at the moment is called Zombie. And one of the constraints I had is because I want them to be linked and I want this overall universe, I can't have a zombie apocalypse that ruins the world because then that cuts off my hands to write any other books that are standalone because you can't have a zombie apocalypse and then write about something where there isn't a zombie apocalypse. So it forced me to it is a zombie novel, but it's an isolated sort of localized event that could be referred to in other books, but it's going to be, a newspaper headline and probably covered up by the government at the end. So it forced me to go, right, I can't write a typical zombie novel where the whole world falls to it. It's got to be self-contained. It's got to begin and then end, with this neat little ribbon at the end so that I can still write these books in the same universe that it exists, it happened, but it didn't affect all the other books to the point where I've got to include zombies in every novel, because they're everywhere. They're not. It's just going to be this certain stories about zombies and it's self-contained. So creating this sort of this shared universe, it does add certain constraints, but that's in this case it's forced me to be a little bit different and write a story about zombies that's going to be different. It's not going to be your typical zombie apocalypse. So it's good to kind of set yourself some boundaries and build a world with rules and laws that you need to kind of keep to. And I suppose I really enjoy reading fantasy and swords and sorcery and stuff like that. And I always love the way their world building of people like Brandon Sanderson and Brent
Yeah,
Weeks and George Martin. And, they have to create so many things and remember them and make sure everything's consistent. And I really respect that. So, like you said, with horror, it's very much in the here and now. I could write a horror book with zero research and it be correct, because I just have to base it on, if I set it, someone's locked in a basement with an angry dog, all I need to know about is dogs and basements. There's not a lot to know. Whereas these fantasy writers, they have to know about history, they have to know about, all sorts of things, to get their worlds correct. And I suppose having a little chance of doing that within my horror books by creating a universe and sharing, links and having to set up certain rules and remember certain points that might have happened years ago in a book I barely remember, having to kind of keep that all together. It's kind of a new challenge for me at this point in my career.
cool. All right. Yeah, it's always important to challenge yourself, and not just any given day and work and so forth, so you can continue moving forward and trying something new and surprising yourself sometimes. What's interesting is during our conversation, probably with every answer that you've given, you've probably had about 3 points that I wanted to touch on, but there's just not enough time in any given day. I'll probably review this again and start writing notes down. So there's other books that you've written, like Housemates, that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about Hell on Earth, The Spread. You've written so much, but as you said, it's so easy if you've written so many books. It's so easy to forget the characters, forget subplots, and that sort of thing. So I'd love to have you on again if you're interested. I'll probably say, "Hey, Iain, we're going to talk about this and that," so you can kind of remind yourself because it does get difficult. But thank you so much for taking your time out of your day. I know you said 9 children in the
Yeah,
background,
I'm
and
so
they've been so
sorry about the
quiet.
noise. They were told to not bother me in the office, but it sounded like people were being murdered. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the kids are kids. That's what
I
they do.
know.
So
Well, I did.
thank.
My wife kind of sprang it on me that all her friends and kids are coming round, and I'm like, I've got an interview, and she's like, "Oh no," and I'm like, "Well, it is what it is. Just tell them to start the office," which they did. No one tried to get in, but it did. There was a few screams here and there, so I do apologise for that.
No worries. I'm
Very
sure it was
professional.
only for a brief moment, but If you want to check out Ian's work, like I said, he offers so many books for free. Just go to his website, sign up. All you got to do is throw in your email. Check him
Yeah,
out
you can
on Facebook.
unsubscribe at any time. So I will send you emails once you've subscribed. But if I get on your nerves, you can unsubscribe, and you've still got the books. You don't need to give them back. So
All right. Thanks, Ian, for joining us. I wish you all the best of luck with your next book in your series and everything after that. So thanks for taking part.
thanks, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.